Habitat Yapi. This is Nick Estes here for the Red Nation podcast. A quick update on what has been going on the last 2 months. We're living through a very dangerous moment here in Minnesota, Makoche. We are 2 months, barely 2 months into Operation Metro Surge, and there's still no end in sight. Nowhere is safe. Not schools, not daycares, not public parks, not shopping centers or hospitals. We've seen people abducted from all of these places, all of these locations. And what was presented as a crackdown on the worst of the worst is hardened into something far more dangerous, an open-ended campaign of terror and political theater carried out on the occupied streets of Minneapolis and increasingly over other parts of Minnesota. There is a never-ending state of emergency. The presence of federal officers who outnumber local police has become normalized. Murder and abduction are sort of the collateral damage of this occupation, and a general feeling of terror feels like this is the intended outcome of what, not just the Trump administration wants, but his officials within the Department of Homeland Security. And today I wanted to just do a quick news rundown. I'll add some analysis at the end for folks, but I felt like it might be a good moment to kind of stop and take a breather. Minneapolis has been going hard for the last 3 weeks, if not more, in this occupation. There's no other word that comes to mind. And so I picked out some incidents that have happened recently, some bad things and some good things. But I think it's worth just going over the timeline. So Operation Metro Surge formally began on December 1st of 2025 last year. And that included sort of a deployment of ICE agents and Custom and Border Patrol people through our agents in St. Paul and Minneapolis. The headquarters of the ICE the headquarters of ICE in this area is at a place called the Fort Snelling area and a place called the Bishop Henry Whipple building. And this is kind of ironic. I'll get to both of those things later on, but Fort Snelling is a historic site. It was the first sort of military outpost of the United States in this area. But also Bishop Henry Whipple was an Episcopalian missionary in this area who's well known for his work among indigenous people and specifically the Dakota in his conversion efforts of Dakota people to Christianity. So it's no wonder that this is just a continuum of that sort of colonial attitude and behavior. And while the Operation Metro Surge really intensified, you see the influx of more and more federal agents. You see these kind of confrontations breaking out. Local communities have been organizing ICE rapid response in local areas. It's very regional. It's very localized, like by neighborhood and also block. There are block captains who are in charge of sort of the general safety of their neighbors. And so you saw on January 7th of this year, an ICE agent by the name of Jonathan Ross, who shot and killed Renee Good. Recent autopsy found that she was actually shot on the side of the temple, meaning that by the time she had, we all saw the video, but by the time she had driven, almost past the ICE agent, he actually executed her near point blank through a window in the side of the head. So it was, and her final words were something along the lines of, "We're not mad at you, dude." And the ICE agent who was filming this entire encounter, as if he was some kind of like man or human drone, said, and this was picked up on the audio of his iPhone, I guess is what he was recording on. He said, "Effin' BITCH," right? So it kind of shows you the animosity and the hate that these agents have towards everyday people. It was also found out that Jonathan Ross himself had received extensive military and law enforcement training, thus should have been the debunking moment for this idea that Democrats are now promoting, that we need to reform ICE, we need to make it nicer. These police need more training, they need more body cams, they need more oversight and regulations and how they're interacting with everyday civilians. And it's important to point out that like Renee Good wasn't the first death of ICE. There were others. Many have died in ICE custody. Many more have just disappeared. We don't know their whereabouts. So it's important to point out that this was somebody who was a legal observer who was actually just executed by ICE. And immediately, Kristi Noem got on national television and announced that Renee Good herself was a domestic terrorist. And Trump, in his narcissism, also went on air and told, the world that, she was, basically a domestic terrorist as well, but he had found out that her parents were Trump supporters. And so he doesn't know what happened. And so he's also famous for saying, I could go onto Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody in the street and people would still vote for me. And he's effectively done that in the context of just that one shooting, but there were others. So there were mass protests and demonstrations that followed. Tens of thousands of people showed up in Powder Park where Renee Good was killed, and the intensification of confrontation with federal agents just escalated and continued. There were various kind of legal attempts on behalf of Democratic leadership to take ICE to court, to take DHS to court, and to challenge, the tactics that ICE was deploying. A district court limited federal agents' ability to detain peaceful protesters around January 16th, January 17th. That was later, overturned on appeal. At least, the sort of injunction that the court had issued. And so as of this moment, the state of Minnesota has also lost I think it was on Friday, it lost its case to basically sue and to get ICE out of Minnesota. So on the legal front, they have been sort of losing. I guess the other, upshot to that is that because of mass protests here in the city and surrounding suburbs, and ICE detention facilities in Texas, you actually had people in family detention, protesting, and people outside of family detention protesting the place where Liam Ramos and his father were abducted. Liam Ramos, you've seen the iconic image of that 5-year-old boy who was taken after school, and then, according to teachers, was used as sort of bait to by ICE agents to coax out to lure out his mother, and then he was later, detained and imprisoned in a family detention facility in Texas. He just returned home today, as far as I know. There were some pictures of him floating around, which is, a significant win. And it shows, that these mass mobilizations are producing wins, despite the inability or the unwillingness of state officials to really take charge of the situation and to actually defend the community. And, on January 20th and 23rd, there were, widespread regional labor and student actions against Operation Metro Surge. People were doing walkouts. I believe the day that, was it the day or day after the killing of Renee Good, Custom and Border Patrol officers actually attempted to raid Roosevelt High School and were filmed deploying chemical munitions at point blank range on children, on high school students. But they were also, this was January 14th, I should say. They were also tackling students in the snow, You also see around the middle of the month after Renee Good's killing, the month of January, you see a lot of intense protests at the Whipple building itself. They begin to construct barricades. It becomes more militarized. Before, there really wasn't anything there other than a fence. You also see, elected officials such as Ilhan Omar being denied entry into these federal facilities, even despite the law. And so at the same time, as there's this kind of full court press of attacks on everyday people, no matter their citizenship status, regardless of the law, regardless of Fourth Amendment rights. And Fourth Amendment rights are essentially rights that protect individuals from illegal search and seizure. So that's why we have the system in the United States where it requires a judge to sign a search warrant. And as we've seen multiple times since the beginning of Operation Metro Surge and before that, ICE doesn't really care about the law, doesn't really care about Fourth Amendment rights. So this constant appeal to the rule of law, right, has it's a good rhetorical kind of thing to say, Fourth Amendment rights. But in reality and in actual practice, the Department of Homeland Security doesn't really care about people's constitutional rights. And constitutional rights extend beyond just citizenship as well. And that's something that's constantly getting ignored, even though people are sort of invoking the ideals of liberalism. We are a nation of laws, and the law, if we just peacefully protest, the law is going to sort everything out. And so far, the law has not sorted everything out. And in fact, I think waiting for the law, whatever that is, to step up and to really protect people has actually been a dangerous gambit on the behalf of politicians, because we've seen 2 shooting deaths, right? And we've seen other incidences in which ICE agents or federal agents have shot people that they're trying to apprehend, and then making up stories afterwards about the details or the circumstances surrounding those shootings. Like there was one on the north side in a predominantly Black neighborhood where 2 individuals were detained by ICE. One was shot in the leg. And subsequently, federal agents deployed tear gas, effectively tear gassing a family, and a young infant had to be rushed to the emergency room because they were foaming at the mouth, right? And when I think of all this, I think of this is a kind of a mild form. People are saying, people say a lot of things. People say, ICE gets training from the IDF and all these other things. But, this is, there's 2 things about that. I think there's more of I think the IDF is co-constitutive of U.S. empire. It's not necessarily the determining factor. The Israeli Defense Forces or the Zionist occupation forces, whatever you want to call them. I think this idea that Zionism is a uniquely aberrant kind of phenomenon or ideology really ignores the historical formations that have happened. Manifest Destiny, U.S. settler colonialism has preceded the modern form of Zionism as we know it today by centuries. And by body count as well. It's not, even though this isn't a comparison of suffering. It's just to say, if anything, the Zionist project in Palestine is an extension of European colonialism, and in this current moment, it's an extension of European imperialism, U.S. imperialism in West Asia. But nonetheless, these instances reminded me of because as I was watching some of them unfold on live streams, I recognize the locations. Many of them are by schools. They're almost all in residential areas. And so the deployment of these chemical weapons reminds me of places that I visited in places like Sheikh Jarrah or in the West Bank, where you have schools and houses right next to the occupation's wall. And it's one of the most tear gassed, places in the world, and where children, are regularly sort of tear gassed by, Zionist soldiers. And this is now something that they're saying, has come home. But if you've been paying attention for the last centuries, this is something that is really intimate to a lot of Native people and Black people, right? In dealing with the histories of racial terror. as a result of U.S. settler colonialism. My friend Charisse Brinstelli calls this, the imperial slingshot, not necessarily the imperial boomerang, right? Because the United States, if you think about its westward expansion, it was, in 1787, when the United States, wrote its U.S. Constitution, where I'm at right now, on the east bank of the Mississippi River, this was land that the United States had declared as its territory, although there was no presence here, right? And so what it did is sort of slingshot settlers or military forces here and built a fort, Fort Snelling. And I want to screen share for just 1 second, because there's this really wonderful article that my colleague David Chang had written shortly after the murder of Renee Good, and it's a history of Fort Snelling. It's called Fort Snelling: The Advance Guard of Federal Evasion Since 1805. The subtitle is "Federal Agents Are Once More Using Fort Snelling for Its Established Purpose to Maintain a Monopoly on Violence." And that term, monopoly on violence, comes from a tradition of Marxism and social theory about the state, and specifically the state as a form of class rule. And in the context of the United States, we can think of it as the state as a form of colonial rule. And this isn't a metaphor, right? And this is why this article is really important to read and to understand the history. This is a picture of the Bishop Henry Whipple building at Fort Snelling. It's where ICE is headquartered for the 5-state region. So whenever there's an ICE case that happens, typically they're brought here to this area, and that includes Minnesota, Iowa, South Dakota, and North Dakota, and I'm missing one. A state, Minnesota, Iowa, Nebraska. Yeah, that's the other one that's in there. So the idea of a monopoly on violence is that the state itself, uses violence in the strict sort of Marxist sense. It uses violence as a form of class rule, right? And that class rule in the context of the United States can't be divorced from settler colonialism. So when you build a fort, here in the context of Fort Snelling, which was established through a fraudulent treaty known as the Treaty of 1805, a treaty that was never really, even by the U.S.'s own standards, ratified. Nonetheless, that sort of delineated what the United States viewed as its military reservation, an area that encompassed lots of what is today Minneapolis, but currently would exist as this sort of unorganized territory. As it's actually, if you look at it on Google Maps or something like that, calls it an unorganized territory, is a complex of federal and military bases, as well as the old fort, which was reconstructed in the mid 20th century after it fell into disrepair. This fort, once served as a concentration camp after the U.S. Dakota War. Dakota people were housed there. It was the first sort of attempt for the United States to exert its monopoly on violence over the region, to subdue and to defeat indigenous sovereignty, not just for Dakota people, but also Ojibwe people. In its initial formation, it also sought to exert control and authority over Ho-Chunk people who also originate from this territory, as well as Sac and Fox and Menominee people. So it wasn't just about Dakota people. It was also about, coming into this region and now setting up shop to say, we're the ones in charge. And it wasn't, it's important to say that it's established as a military fort first and foremost. It's not a hospital, it's not Cuba, right? The intentions are very clear that it's going to annex and conquer this territory. It has to effectively consummate its control over the region through the use of force or the threat of the use of force. And we can see this in the genocide that ensues in 1862. And so I highly recommend reading this article by my colleague, David Chang. It's really good at laying out this history of the fort, but also the sort of underlying causes of why this even exists in the first place. And so for many of us, history hasn't really passed, because the United States in this region still sort of exerts its monopoly of violence, not just against Native people now, but now we're seeing it against anyone who opposes this federal authority. So let me switch over. I'll stop screen sharing. So that was to kind of get back to the timeline. I kind of diverged a little bit, went off on a tangent as I do. There are some other events that happened, that I think are incredibly important, and I want to talk about them. But I want to kind of wrap up this timeline by talking also about the murder of Alex Pretty, who was the ICU nurse. And it's important to remember that all these killings, whether it was George Floyd, whether it was Renee Good or Alex Pretty, they all happened within a mile of each other. It's like if you were driving by a car, it'd be like about a 5-minute drive to see all of these killing sites. So the south side of Minneapolis, especially, but Minneapolis in general, has undergone this culling and killing of its people for going on a decade now. And it's almost as if the city is in a constant state of mourning. But I also want to talk about, the city is kind of like serves as a laboratory for these kinds of tactics. And something really piqued my interest recently when I was on X or Twitter or whatever it's called. I saw that the individual who had started filming the Somali daycare centers here in the city, Somali-run daycare centers here in the city, was now in Los Angeles doing the exact same thing, creating the conditions of a federal intervention. And so I think this guy's name, I always get him mixed up. There's so many right-wing influencers. Let me look him up. I think it's either Nick Sorter or Nick Shorter. No, is it Nick? Gosh, I can't even remember. What is? Let's see. I should have had this in my notes. Let's see. What is this guy's name? Yes, his name is Nick Shirley. Whatever, man. They're all like, I can't. There are people who claim to be from here, but I don't even know who they are. Anyways, Nick Shirley showed up at several daycare centers throughout the city and tried to film children and tried to film staff and tried to film parents. And, of course, people were like rightly so like really suspect of him. But he created this narrative that there's fraud going on at these, daycare centers. And trust me, there has been fraud in this state. I've seen it, there was the big case around Feeding Our Future. It was like a $250 million fraud scandal around COVID-19 meals. And people kind of blamed it on the Somali community. There were Somali individuals who were involved, but at the top of it was like a white woman who was kind of the mastermind of the entire thing. And now, this kind of like was the impetus, or at least the justification for this federal intervention. And if you know anything about Minnesota, the Somali community, I think it's like 95% or more are U.S. citizens and who have immigrated here legally. I mean, as if that matters, but it didn't matter to, this kind of broader narrative that the Trump administration was creating and crafting about this sort of deviant, criminal Somali element. They're invoking, like even Dinesh D'Souza, that total fraud, was like posting some of the most grotesquely racist AI videos of Somali people, who they're calling like welfare queens or welfare kings, whatever, trotting out that language again. I just find that really ironic because if you look at who's the head of DHS, Kristi Noem, and I should just do a whole episode on Kristi Noem. People have been asking for this. South Dakota is so small that it's 1 degree of separation from everybody, so like I know people who knew Kristi Noem or know Kristi Noem. They're not like friends with them, but just working in this in the state system. But if you look at Kristi Noem, she was, her whole career was created off this idea. Her political career was created off this idea that she had to pay an inheritance tax because her dad, died in this farming accident, which is a true story. But he wasn't just some kind of salt of the earth dude. Like he was part of this huge corporate farming conglomerate that was getting like millions of dollars over the last, decades, like millions, like almost $5 million that at least you can count through public records and federal subsidies. So, Kristi Noem herself has benefited from federal handouts, right, to make and to subsidize the farming, corporate agriculture in South Dakota. So it's just ironic, somebody should be doing a fraud investigation of them, like if that's what they really care about, because I'm sure that totals in billions of dollars going to, corporate, farming conglomerates, and you get people like Kristi Noem, who launches her whole political career off of that. But nonetheless, let's blame the Somalis, right? So that was sort of the impetus for, this guy, Nick Shirley, coming in. Now he's in, LA trying to do the exact same thing, crafting the same narrative. And, really kind of drumming up a lot of this kind of idea that like there's this criminal, immigrant element within the United States that has to be exported or deported. They have to be attacked. They have to be terrorized. They have to be chased out of here, right? So while DHS is, waging this terror campaign of just like literally going and abducting people, whether they're citizens or not, doesn't matter. They're also doing this other sort of terror campaign and psychological warfare campaign to get people to self-deport. And they're claiming like millions of people have self-deported as a result of these, pressure tactics that they're employing. At the same time, you have the Department of Homeland Security claiming that it made over 3,000 arrests. We can't actually verify any of this. Hundreds of, legal observers or just everyday people who are out and about have been arrested. We don't actually know the numbers on that because DHS hasn't provided them. But nonetheless, we have the most recent killing, right, of Alex Preddy, the ICU nurse, which is really fascinating. There's been a lot kind of writing on this particular story. He was a concealed carry, permitted concealed carry gun owner. He had showed up to this protest or to this action, whatever it was. He was as a legal observer with a concealed 9mm handgun. The DHS has made hay about this, which doesn't justify his murder by any means. Like I'm not like here to like run, the liberal counter narratives to all this First Amendment rights, Second Amendment rights, Fourth Amendment rights. Those things don't really matter, right, to the people who are doing this kind of violence, right? They're violence workers. Alex Preddy was a care worker, right? He worked in an ICU at the Veterans Administration Hospital. But one of the things that came out shortly after his murder, there was a historic strike, which I'll talk about in a little bit. That's like I'm saving that for like the good news part of this whole rundown. It was the day after this general strike when historic, numbers like 70,000 plus people took to downtown Minneapolis. It was so massive. I'll show the videos in a little bit. But Alex Preddy was like murdered the next day. So we had this high and then an extremely low the next day. He was executed, shot in the back, what we can tell by our own eyes by watching the video multiple times. And, it was very tragic. It was like, kind of jolting experience for a lot of people because, not only are their neighbors getting abducted, children being attacked at schools. Now they're just like executing, people in the streets, because what else would it be? And I'll be quite frank, this isn't fact, right? This is me just kind of editorializing a little bit and talking about how I felt. But when I first watched that video, to me, it felt like a hit, essentially, that there was the intention that this guy was not going to walk away from this interaction and this confrontation, which, says several things. One of them, that came to mind right away is that they knew this person, they knew this individual. And shortly after this video of his execution came out, caused a lot of controversy. You saw Kristi Noem do the exact same thing. She called him a domestic terrorist. Greg Bovino got on the mic and, was saying, all kinds of things. He brandished a weapon, all this other stuff, which is totally false and untrue. Trump later said, which I thought was hilarious. He said, don't carry guns. Like, that was a direct quote, like just completely, torching his Second Amendment supporters. The infamous Chud, Kyle Rittenhouse, didn't say anything about it. He's like the First Amendment murderer or Second Amendment murderer of those individuals in Kenosha, Wisconsin, during the George Floyd uprising. And, so it was kind of this like weird moment of like, so which is it? They're basically like saying, if you encounter federal agents, like just hold your breath, because if you breathe the wrong way, you're going to get killed. And you should know that, right? Whereas, during the COVID-19 pandemics, we saw probably some of these same Customs and Border Patrol agents and ICE agents carrying guns, long rifles at state capitals, had extensive magazines on them. They even like stormed the Capitol on January 6th and participated in what was called an insurrection. So it's just kind of ironic, like you can't get more hypocritical than this. And I think people were just like, they're like, yeah, this is so the levels of absurdity and hallucinatory kind of narration that's going on and gaslighting has reached levels that I haven't really seen, at least in my short time on this, on this planet. Nonetheless, like clockwork, days later, another video surfaced of Alex Pretty engaging with CPB agents and then subsequently kicking out a taillight of one of their vehicles. And I always want to play a little bit of it because it's important to kind of put this into perspective, because it's a very kind of clever cut, and I'll show you why. And this hasn't, to my knowledge, been reported on any media, so you're seeing it now, folks, for the first time. But let me just share my screen, and we'll watch the first part of the video.
New footage has emerged of Alex Pretty, filmed 11 days before he was fatally shot by Border Patrol officers in Minneapolis on January 24th. In the footage, filmed on January 13th, Pretty is seen here, shouting expletives and spitting at a federal immigration agent's car during a protest. He then kicks the agent's vehicle, breaking a tail light. The agents exit their vehicle, and a scuffle takes place. Pretty, on the ground, loses his coat. When he gets back up, what appears to be a handgun is visible in his waistband. At no point do the videos show Pretty reaching for the gun, and it is unclear whether the federal agents saw it. Agents then deploy smoke canisters and drive away.
So we've seen this video, right? It's very familiar, and it just came out, and it kind of like, for a lot of right wingers and Trump people, MAGA people, this was like the confirmation that they needed, right? That this guy was an agitator. Look, he looks unhinged. In this video, he's like angry. We don't know. He's spitting on the cops. He's kicking out the taillight. He has a gun. He gets in a scuffle. As far as we know, he like left. He walked away from that incident. But this is the thing: is like it was such a clever cut, because it didn't show what happened before this. And it was quite fascinating as somebody who watches a lot of these videos and kind of like, lives in this city and like knows what's happening, because what you're seeing in the news is like not even true. It's a fraction, or it's a version of reality that just doesn't exist. It's like an alternate reality that they're portraying to the rest of the world. And this is what I want to show you, because that incident, right, happened right after the murder of Renee Good, and it was days before before Alex Pretty himself was murdered and killed. But let me just show you a clip of what actually happened before that. And it's important to remember that this is what Alex Pretty is actually responding to, and what that crowd is actually responding to. So in this clip, they're pulling a woman from her car, quite brutally. She's announcing that she's disabled. She's on her way to the doctor's office. Pure distress, right? She's cut her seatbelt. So that whole scene, played out. It made local news. The woman who was brutalized, she later appeared on a local news station, like recounting the very traumatic experience that she had during that. So it was quite a big deal locally. I don't know if it made national news or not, but it was one of those moments where it's like, we don't know like if what's happening, like in terms of like if this person is going to get killed, like what are the circumstances under which they're being detained, right? It caused a lot of like controversy locally in the tactics that ICE was deploying, and that's actually the same scene, just moments before the whole incident happens with Alex Pretty. And I use this as an example, like a media teaching moment, right? And this is what happens when you get outside media and outside journalists coming into a situation. They have one fidelity, right? They're loyal to one thing, and that's the algorithm. And that's the truth, that what's happening, at least, with these right-wing influencers that are coming out, they're a little more honest and transparent about what they're doing, right? They are trying to stir up trouble. They are trying to invoke state repression, right? Jake Lang, that right winger who came to town and tried to hold an anti-Somali pogrom, and he wanted to burn a Quran and all these other things. He was trying to get President Trump, very explicitly so, to invoke the Insurrection Act so that the military could come in here and start shooting people, right? That's their ultimate goal. This, kind of whole thing comes off as like, we're just telling the facts, like we're just giving a more nuanced, fuller picture of who Alex Pretty is, while actually ignoring the very thing that he's responding to. Put yourself in that situation where you're in your own neighborhood. These guys are coming from the outside, they're masked up, they've killed somebody already, right? Tensions are running high, they're abducting somebody, they're coming into areas, they're deploying tear gas, they're shooting bear spray all over the place, they're deploying chemical munitions at schools, they're taking children. They come into this intersection. This woman who, as far as I know, was not part of this protest at all, she was just on her way to the doctor's office, gets violently ripped from her car, assaulted, touched unconsensually, all these things. She talked about this in her interview on the local station. It's pretty like harrowing stuff. And she's just one individual. And what would your reaction be in that moment, right? I'm not saying that I would respond the same way that Alex Pretty would, but we are human beings, right? When we see somebody in distress who has their rights and their dignity being deprived of them, it's only natural to respond and try to intervene to save a life, right? Or to make sure that person is okay. And in that situation, he and others were responding to what was happening in that moment. Like we've seen multiple times over and over again, but the dishonest media is not interested, in these stories. What they're interested in is clickbait rage, right? They want to piss people off, and they want to criminalize local, locals. They want to say that look how unhinged these people are, right? Even while they claim some kind of sympathy or empathy for the victims who are murdered or the people who are being taken, right? They're not interested in the facts of the case. They're interested in what, why I have yet to see an actual media outlet do real reporting on this and say, this is what happened before this. Like, it's really easy to do. If you're from Minneapolis, these streets. This isn't like some kind of like off street, right? This is in the heart of the South Side. All you got to do is look at the buildings around and figure where you're at. So is local media, national media is this such a foreign place to them that they can't actually like talk to anybody, or they can't even like use Google Maps and like enter cross streets or like pinpoint dates, or like, you know what I mean? It's like the absurdity of it is dangerous, right? Because now it's put this narrative out there, just about one individual, not just about one individual, because this is collective punishment, right? And this is collective depiction. We've seen what happens to journalists who just merely, document what's happening. Like right now, who would have thought that like people would be, talking about Don Lemon, he was arrested, alongside, other independent journalists who were filming, a protest at a local church. And it's just wild to me that people are like upset about the church protest and the arrest of Don Lemon, because, when has this country really cared about Black churches? And I think back to Dylan Roof, literally going into a church, an AME church, and just executing Black people, right? Where was the outrage? This is a long history of, bombing churches during the civil rights movement. The person who they were targeting at that protest, he is the interim director of the regional ICE facility, right? And he claims to be, a pastor, a man of God. And, they have every right to go into that church. And, it doesn't excuse any of the actions that this individual has done, the horror that he's inflicted on his own community. So I think that's important to just kind of like point out, because there were also, another like local independent journalist named Georgia Fort, who's also a Black woman, who was also arrested. There was also a local activist named Nakima. She's a lawyer. She was also arrested. And, she gave a Nakima Levi Armstrong, that's who it was. And also Chantel Allen, who I think is some kind of elected official in St. Paul. I don't actually know who that person is, but these are all Black people who they are trying to vilify and criminalize as being some kind of like, unhinged left-wing agitators, right? And thus justifying not only their arrests and these DOJ investigations, but also the brutalization and the execution, of people in Minneapolis. It's quite a thing to be living through at this moment in time. And so with that said, I kind of want to shift gears a little bit and talk about like what the community has been doing in response. And that's incredibly important because, as I said, January 23rd was a day of action. It was billed as a general strike. People in labor are debating it. We can't call it a general strike because it's against the law. It's like, dude, we're beyond like legality at this moment. It's like, is it legal to murder people in the street? Apparently it is. If we accept the rule of law as this kind of like abstract principle, this social construct that's supposed to be keeping everything together, right? Because the very existence of Fort Snelling is actually against the law, right? And the United States and Washington has known this for, almost more than 2 centuries, that like its footprint in this area began with with an illegal occupation, right, and a fraudulent treaty. That should tell you something, about how the U.S. operates. But what I find, really compelling is that January 23rd was a massive day of action. I can't even, I'd have to spend a whole podcast episode going over all the various things that took place that day, all the work that went into, putting that on. They had a massive rally down. January 23rd was a massive day of action. Everyone was participating. I think what really made it real for me was when the daycare workers where my child goes, said that they were going to be participating. Our daycare closed, the university closed. They claim it was weather, but I think there was so much pressure from the unions, from the faculty, the staff, the students, that this was untenable. Like we're beyond the boiling point right now. It's an explosion, right? And so people took to the streets. In frigid temperatures, like the wind chill was like negative 30 degrees Fahrenheit, which was ridiculous. I hadn't worn snow pants since 2016 when I was at Standing Rock. So it was my first foray in a long time, in almost a decade, into snow pants, which didn't really help, it was still very cold. But it was a massive event. And to kind of put it into perspective, like we're living in an age of mass protests. And I know as leftists, we typically, an anti-imperialist and progressive and, people who are part of these traditions, we look back at the 1960s, the 1970s, the civil rights movement. We look back at that era as an era of uprising and social upheaval and all of these things. People were on the streets, and the numbers in the protests that we've witnessed thus far exceed a lot of these kind of historic events. Like there was the Palestine protest in Washington, D.C. Hundreds of thousands of people were there. That's massive, right? During the most intense and dire days of the genocide in Gaza. In Minneapolis, for example, in the past 2 Fridays, Minneapolis residents participated in some of the city's largest protests in history. Both were billed as general strikes. So for comparison, the city's famed, and I got these numbers, by the way, from my friend Jackson Kerr. Shout out to Jackson Kerr. We were in a Signal chat, and we were kind of going back and forth, debating about the meaning of these mass mobilizations, and trying to put it into historical perspective. So for comparison, the city's famed, 1934 general strike, the Teamsters Rebellion, as it's also known, when about 15,000 workers walked off the job, did not draw the same levels of mass participation as the last 2 protests have. Though it's unclear how many workers actually walked off their job on those Fridays. I mean, we can guess, but some people would call that a disorganized action. Some people will call it an organized action. I'm not here to debate. I'm just talking about numbers, right? And so just to put that into perspective, Minneapolis has about the same population as it did. Today it has about the same population as it did in 1934. Minneapolis has gone, this is a whole nother story, but Minneapolis has gone through this population boom and decline, and it's currently still kind of in that decline. It's never really regained the numbers it had around World War II, that whole era. But nonetheless, this also doesn't take into consideration the surrounding suburbs, et cetera. But the largest protest in 1934 was around 40,000 people, right? And we can look, I'm going to show you right now, the numbers of people who took to the street. It was absolutely mind-boggling. I think I actually had to ask, when I saw this picture, I was like, is that AI? But this is the January. It's not even really, it's an okay, piece of footage, but it doesn't even really get to how big it is. Then I'm going to share this other one. Yeah, so these these protests were historic, right? And this is really, I'm gonna wrap it up here pretty soon, because we're entering into a really dark phase of this whole operation, and I think you can read the fatigue on a lot of people's faces. There's been widespread sort of mutual aid networks, city by, block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood, city by city. People are organized in ways that haven't happened before. And this demonstrates that this is a defiance of this kind of like really kind of cutthroat idea that, when basically when the state abandons you, right? And all these structures break down, like local law enforcement has just given up, right? They're not interested in defending people. They're not interested in defending the community. In fact, recent, shifts within the political elite, whether it's, I just listened to an interview with Mayor Frey this morning, Jacob Frey. He's the mayor of our city. He was also the mayor during the George Floyd uprising. He was the mayor who said, like, I refuse to, abolish the MPD, even after they've murdered all these people and just terrorized the city. In fact, he was like on a campaign of restoration, of restoring the numbers of the Minneapolis Police Department. He hasn't really done that. There's just like a lack, complete lack of morale. The community just like in general hates the cops. And has done, even despite the rapid decline in the local police forces, their numbers, they like crime has gone down, murders have gone down. I think as it stands right now, I think ICE has made up, or I guess the federal agents, and this Operation Metro Surge is officially constitutes half of the homicides, or like maybe 2/3 of the homicides in the city just this year. So like crime is down in the city, whatever that means, and there was this idea that, they're coming in and getting the so-called worst of the worst, or cleaning up the city because these Democrats can't control their own population. But Mayor Frey goes on the New York Times podcast this morning, and he talks about not necessarily like he's talking about, he's doing the political thing. He's like, I'm worried about my community. But then when asked about how he feels about being investigated by the Department of Justice for the things that he said, and they're basically accusing him of encouraging people to obstruct federal law enforcement, he only talked about himself. He's like, I'm a father, I'm worried, and blah, 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 blah. And to me, that was a clear sign of like weakness. I had suspected it, for a while, that this, like, even though they're kind of projecting this like image of like, they're on all these, he's on the New York Times podcast, right? He's getting interviewed by like CNN. They did a CNN town hall. I didn't watch it. There's other things going on that are more important. He just loves talking in front of the camera, right? But it was just fascinating. This man was like worried about himself in that moment. Like, and if it was, what's interesting about it is if you go back and you look at like Nikema Armstrong's interview, when they asked her after she was arrested, right? This lawyer, the social justice lawyer, was arrested after this church protest. She's like, it's not about me. They're kidnapping children. She named, Liam Ramos, the 5-year-old who was kidnapped. She named all these people who were murdered. She named everyone in her community who had been taken, because she said, this is not about me. It's about, it's about our community. And like Mayor Frey was like, it's really about me, right? And so it was kind of a fascinating interview, because it confirmed for me what I've thought for a while, and that, even though Governor Tim Walz, he was the running mate of Kamala Harris, claims to be, putting on this kind of like strong face in this moment of absolute turmoil in his state, he also decided not to run for governor again, right? Which means that the pressure campaigns by the Trump administration are working, because he's also under a DOJ investigation, right? And they're also investigating the alleged fraud that has taken place under his administration, right? So it's fascinating that in this moment that they're, you can kind of look into their interior lives and to see that they really only care about themselves and the preservation of this, dying corpse. I don't know what you want to call it anymore, of the Democratic Party in this moment. It's absolute inability to effectuate any kind of defense of the most vulnerable people, right? Where were the police? I'm just saying these are rhetorical questions, but where were the police when people like Nick Shirley were showing up to these daycare centers trying to film children, right? This should be like, we should all didn't we all like trauma bond around the Epstein files about these, pedophile rings and elites who are, abusing children, and then they're like attacking children. The right-wing influencers are coming in and attacking children, and then they're going into the schools and they're attacking children. They're detaining children. They're like going after the most vulnerable people. That should tell you something, right? And that these politicians can put up no defense, absolutely no defense for them whatsoever. We live, even before the arrival and the intensification of these federal goons, Minnesota has the second highest rate of Indian child removal of any state in the nation, higher than South Dakota, the kind of flaming torch of anti-Indianism where Kristi Noem comes from. This state, was mired in family separation and targeting Native children, right? The MPD was if you read the DOJ report, the most likely individual to be held at gunpoint by the MPD was a Native child, a minor, right? And so when we think of these people who are supposed to represent us, I just think, how do they treat children? And what do they actually think about children in this moment? And it's a reflective of their kinds of politics, right? Because I'm with the kids, at the end of the day, and it's not because I'm a father, it's because I'm a human being. And the rest of us who are out here on the streets, in our jobs, in our workplaces, in the classroom, we also care about each other and people. And that's what's overtaking this moment. Despite all the, you can listen to the other podcasts with, our comrades from IPM, the Indigenous Protector Movement, and NDN Collective, Lorenzo Serna and Rachel Thunder are on the newest podcast. And you can listen to them, because this is at the end of the day, it's you can call it what you want, but it's kind of like spiritual warfare, but it's also just about fundamental human solidarity. And that is really what's carrying us, in this moment in time. And it's some call it fascism. I would call it something much worse, because the truth is that this isn't the first time we've been here. And perhaps it isn't the worst time in the history of this land. I hate to say it, because it's no consolation for anyone living through this current nightmare. But this country in which we now live is severely menaced, not by Putin, not by Xi, not by the Ayatollah, but from within, right? And it has almost always been from within, despite America's best attempts to find a boogeyman to blame for its problems, right? And so what we're seeing right now is not a turn towards the Democratic Party, even though they're trying their best to co-opt this moment and transform it into electoral midterm campaigns. If we wait till the midterm campaigns, we're all going to be dead or locked up. I don't know. I don't want to be hyperbolic. I'm being hyperbolic about that right now. But I also think it's important to understand, as I've learned as a historian and learned and studied our own traditions of resistance, and to study resistance movements the world over, and to think about, countries like Iran, who have resisted U.S. imperialism despite everything. Countries like Cuba, who have resisted a genocidal blockade despite everything. Even Venezuela, Nicaragua, the anti-imperialist, bloc of the world has resisted these genocidal blockades and these genocidal actions, sanctions, all kinds of sabotage, kidnapping presidents, assassination of political leaders, endless bombing campaigns, right? Absolute demonization of anything, right? That they do, but they're not short-term thinkers. They're long-term thinkers, just like our ancestors were long-term thinkers. I wouldn't be here today if my ancestors were not long-term thinkers. And so I take solace in the histories of resistance and to understand that we are running a very, very long marathon right now. And what seems like absolute nightmare and urgency, we have to like feed that algorithm or respond to it. We have to let those, that adrenaline rush through us every time we witness one of these things, whether it's in person or watching the video, repeat over and over and over and over again, and then deal with the consequences of that come down, right? That dopamine come down, that dopamine hangover, that adrenaline hangover, that what we're experiencing is like collective, PTSD. And in some ways we're trauma bonding a little bit. This is Nick speaking as just on a personal, like person-to-person level. We're trauma bonding in some ways, but some of us who have been through these moments in time have a little bit more resilience to some of these things. Not to say that we're desensitized. By no means are we desensitized, because people are operating out of love and care for each other. But also it almost it's kind of worth just kind of taking a step back and realizing that this is a historic time. Not just in the horrors or the nightmare that this colonial system is inflicting on all of us, but we're also in a historic time in the sense that, as I pointed out, there's been like multiple books written about the Teamsters Rebellion in 1934, but what we've witnessed just with the Palestine protests, if you take the Palestine protests alone, they far exceed that kind of the kind of mobilization and mass support. If you take the most recent protests against ICE, they far exceed those kinds of historic moments and inflection points that we think about. And it just becomes a question of how do we channel that power into sustainable, movement building? Because I don't want this future for my child. I don't want this future for anyone's, family or children or, descendants. Right. And so in this moment in time, I'm incredibly proud to be, I never really claimed to be from Minneapolis, but I'm incredibly proud to be from Minneapolis in this moment in time. But also it should serve as a sort of wake up call for those who are around the country that this is nothing new. We've been here before. It has been worse. There was an actual genocide. That genocide created the necessary conditions for us to get to this place. And so unless we don't address that history, we're going to keep coming back to this place over and over again. The boogeyman is going to change, but the system is going to stay the same. And so the lesson that we should learn in this moment is that we need to be far thinking individuals, and not just individuals. We need to be far thinking in our organizations, far thinking in how we're engaging in this moment. And sometimes the best thing to do is to turn off that algorithm. It's hard. I know there's a lot happening. The Epstein files were released like on Friday, and like I am just absolutely I'm not surprised by any of this stuff, but it's again, it's kind of like confirming the very kind of depravity, that the interior lives, the depraved nature of these people on the inside is also an expression of their depraved nature on the outside. And that's why we get endless genocide and war. That's the only alternative we have right now in this current political system. And so what we're seeing is the future being built on the ground or in the streets of Minneapolis by everyday people. I hope it matures. I hope it grows. And I'm sure it will. And these lessons will not go unheeded. And I think it's just going to intensify the reaction. The repression is also going to intensify. There's going to be more violence. I mean, I hate to say that. I'm not trying to be gloom and doom here, but that's the reality we're facing. And we really need to reconsider and recalibrate who we think of our enemies and who we think of our friends, and understand that I never thought the word terrorist would be so widely applied, but now it's like including everybody now at this point. So I think October 7th, 2023 was an epochal shift in world history. I think this was, what we're seeing now is kind of a result or a reverberation of that. and also of much more that preceded that. But nonetheless, I think it's worth kind of meditating on this moment in time. It's hard to see and understand history as it's unfolding before you. But I think in this moment, we really need to think about long-term kind of plans about alternatives to this system. So I thank you for all coming on this monologue with me. It went all over the place. It's I was drawing a little bit from a piece I'm currently writing. Maybe when this publishes, I'll link it on the bottom half of the footnote, or I'll link it in the show notes for you all to see. But I hope this was helpful to understand what's happening in Minneapolis. Maybe I'll do an update next week on what's going on. It feels like weeks are like months, and when they pass, days sometimes feel like weeks. So things are rapidly changing on the ground. They got rid of Greg Bovino and put in Tom Homan, who is by no means any better than Bovino. And they put a new face on everything. They put a new spin on everything. They're saying, we're going to be cooperating with federal agents. What cooperation looks like is local law enforcement now arresting legal observers and people who are trying to intervene instead of ICE doing that. We're seeing more of that right now. The conditions haven't changed. People are still getting abducted. People are still getting attacked. People are still not going into work. Rent, people are crowdsourcing for rent. People are crowdsourcing for groceries. People are just like barely surviving. Local businesses are shuttering. So there's a lot of these economic things that, it's actually, I didn't live here during COVID, but I can imagine it's probably worse than what happened during COVID in some ways, or similar in other ways. But we're seeing these kind of long-term economic impacts that I don't think will play out nicely if there's no large-term kind of push or long-term kind of pushback against what's happening. So there's a lot to report on. There's a lot to say, but I thank you all for taking the time. And if you're out on the streets, stay safe, be smart, keep each other safe, but also really question what you're reading and hearing in national media. Trust the sources on the ground, trust local media. We're trying not to really follow the algorithm for a variety of reasons at Red Nation. We had an editorial meeting about this. We don't really do the kind of, clickbait stuff as much. We try to do these kind of long form explanations to really get people grounded, because we live in a world where, our attention is turned to different things, and our attention is used against us in a lot of ways. And we're really trying to get people to think both with their minds, but also feeling with their hearts in this moment, because it's incredibly traumatic, and it should be traumatic. It doesn't justify that trauma, but it's how we respond. We have a control over our response to it, and our response should be to make something better and to build something better. So I really thank you all, and I'll see you soon.